All right, shalom. Yahweh Ba'ashim, Yahweh Shah, Bakathum to the brothers. Shalom, Yahweh Shema, Alathun Ba'ashim, Yahweh Shah to the sisters. With the Israelite School, Universal Practical Knowledge. Started at 1 West, 125th Street, Harlem, New York, under Commanding General Yohanan. We are not affiliated with any other Israelite group nor any other Christian organization. All right? Don't forget to put your name, city, and state to check in and sign in. All right? Don't forget to sign in or check in. Name, city, and state. All right? Baruch Rashad. Do not forget. Do not forget to sign in and check in so you can come up for attendance. All right? Also, if you have any questions, type into the live chat. There'll be no sweat. Put into the live chat. Ask your questions. Ain't no problems with, no issues with it. If you have any questions, put into the live chat. All right. Make sure you like and share. All right. Like, subscribe, and share. All right. Share these videos to whoever you may think that's interested, whatever the case may be. So now, tonight's class. Tonight's class is the history class. The history class is another important class to attend. All classes are important to attend. All right, but tonight's class is a very important class to attend. History is also very history also is very important to know. All right, history is very important to indulge in. As so-called blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, we need to look more into our history. We may need to understand the different things that are happening to us because of our history. Like, we need to understand history and learn about history because it can actually solve some of the issues that we have in modern day. Like the modern day issues and the modern day problems, right, have solutions. But in order for us to understand the modern day problems that we have and the modern day issues that we have to know about history. We have to learn about history. You understand? Like for instance, if you want to troubleshoot a problem and you want to troubleshoot the issue, there's a source to that problem. There's a source to that issue. That source can be far, far back, way back somewhere. Like when you're troubleshooting an issue or a problem, there's a source to that problem and there's a source to that issue. And that source can be far down the line. Like that problem, like the source of that problem and the source of that issue is so far down the line, you would have never thought that could have caused the problem all the way over here. Even though the source of the problem is all the way down there. You would have never known that. You would have thought, like, this is bizarre. You would think that the problem would be closer, right? It would be right here. It would be closer to the problem that we, to the problem that we have. You would think that it would be kind of closer to the problem that we're going through right now, but the source of that problem and the source of that issue is so far down the line you could never imagine it. That's why it's important to understand history, because history can allow us to find that source that we're looking for to solve these modern day issues that we have, to solve these modern day problems that we have specifically in the so-called black, Hispanic, and Native American community. Like, this is something that we need to understand. Now, tonight's topic is about women's liberation, right? The destruction that it caused. All right? Okay? The destruction it caused, Salakia. Now, does anybody know about women's liberation? Does anybody know what women's liberation is really about? Does anybody know online? Does anybody have a little bit of a concept of what women's liberation is about? Anybody? Y'all can give it. Y'all can chime in at any time and ask and answer those questions if you would like. Does anybody know what women's liberation is about? All right. Rights for women. Okay, specifically what type of rights for women? Rights for women how? All right. Being equal with men. Okay. Okay, let me see. Okay. Now I get you guys to look at something real quick. Let me see. Okay, jobs, etc. Okay, bet. Okay, no sweat. Those are good answers. Let me get something set up for y'all. I'm going to read an article online, but as well, I want you guys to see this article. Alright, I want you guys to see this article. That's not what I wanted. That was weird. All right. Okay. Y'all, can y'all see what I can see? Can y'all hear me too as well? Y'all can see what I can see, right? All right. Let me know. So now, this is a simple article, and you can just look up this information at any time, by the way. Now, some of this information about women's rights, women's liberation, is very common knowledge to know kind of now. So to know about women's liberation, you also have to know about women's rights. They both coincide with each other. So women's rights and women's liberation, they pretty much coincide with each other, but there are two different waves. All right, the first wave of women's rights was more so the first wave of women's rights was more so the legalities of them having legal rights when it comes to voting and businesses and jobs and etc. and things like that. Then there is a second wave, and we'll mostly focus on that second wave. And then we're going to also focus also on the topic that women's liberation also had nothing to do with black women. Okay? Women's liberation never really had to deal with black women due to the fact of the time. Well, okay, women's rights didn't have to do much with so-called black women due to the time frame that this was going on. So it says, the article, you guys can read along with me if you guys can see it. Women's rights movement, also called women's liberation movement. Now, like I said, the women's rights movement can also be called the women's liberation movement. Diverse social movement, largely based in the United States. So first things first, the women's rights movement and the women's liberation movement. I'm saying the same thing, quote unquote. They're just two. But to get into more detail, there's two different ways. Alright, this happened in the United States of America. Other countries and other nations, no one was battling their women, right, on what type of rights they had or what type of rights they can do. This specific argument, this specific predicament, this specific situation, Salaki, I think I said Pacific those times. Specific Those specific predicaments, situations, and problems and discussions were happening in America that in the 1960s and 70s sought equal rights and opportunities and greater. So, okay, I'm going to stop there. In the 1960s and 70s sought equal rights. Okay, so equal rights. Now, even though this article says 1960s and 70s, during the 1960s, I'm just going to give y'all some backdrop. The women's rights movement was really way before the 60s. The first women's rights movement, I believe, was sometime in the 1800s. It wasn't that big of a scale, but it started around then. You can look this up if you want to, but for time's sake, I'm only getting this information. I'm just telling you that the women's rights movement started sometime in the 1830s or sometime in the early 1800s, all right? The reason why this article is saying the 60s and 70s, because this was the bigger push on things. Like, it was grind time. Like, women's rights during the 60s and the women's rights movement during the 70s, it was prime time for them to do it. Does anybody know why it was such a good time for so-called white women to push women's liberation and women's rights during the 60s? Does anybody know why that was the best time to do it? And why it was the greatest time to do it? Does anybody know why? Does anybody know why it was a good time for so-called white women to push women's rights, right, during the 1960s to the 70s? Why was that a good? Why does anybody think that was a good way to do it or a good time frame to do it? Does anybody know why? Because remember, women's liberation. Now remember, we should know this as basic knowledge. But if you do not know for basic knowledge, women's rights, right, and women's liberation movement dealt with the so-called white woman first. It never dealt with black women, because black women, first things first, the black man didn't have any rights before the 60s, even during the 60s. So, God forbid, black women were trying to fight for rights before the 60s and during the 60s, right? So the sister said because of the civil rights movement was going on. Yes, that is the correct answer. The reason why it was such a good idea in a good time frame to push the women's liberation movement or the women's rights movement as hard as they did in the 60s is because of the civil rights movement. And who did they get during the civil rights movement to back up the women's liberation movement and the civil rights, the women's liberation movement and the women's rights movement? Who did they get to back them up? Who did the so-called white woman get to back her up during the women's liberation movement and the women's rights movement during civil rights? Who did they get to help them, to assist them, and to aid them? Who did they get? That's correct. They got black women. That's exactly who they got. So during that time, they got black women to aid and support them and help them fight. Because black women were already fighting for what? Black women were also fighting for civil rights. So why not during that time also fight for women's rights and women's liberation? Why not? We're already fighting for civil rights. We're already fighting for legal rights for black people, period. So why not specifically fight for women's rights and women's liberation? Why not? You know? Why not get the mass majority of the people in America, which are so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, to help and aid us into getting women's rights and women's liberation rights? They have so many leaders in charge to speak about this and to allow them to join with us so we can push for women's liberation and women's rights. So let's go back to the article. All right, well, the article's already there for y'all, but I'm going to go back to the article. So the article says, that in the 1960s and 70s saw equal rights and opportunities. So first it was equal rights. Anybody know what equal rights really dealt with? The equal rights dealt with, okay, how can I say this? If you look at equal rights face value, if you take equal rights to face value, they're talking about legal rights, as in the right to vote, the right to own a business, the right to get paid wages as the same as a man, right? If you take it as face value, right? When it comes to equal rights. But there was a hidden and fine line to these rights. All right? There was a fine line to these rights. So, when it comes to women's rights, all right, when it comes to equal rights, if you take it to face value, all right, it's more so about, all right, equal pay, equal wages, owning businesses, owning land on your own, owning real estate on your own, being able to do all these things that women are able to do now, quote unquote, all right, as if they weren't, because at one point in time, so-called white women, all right, our oppressor, they were not able to do those things, all right, specifically their women. Of course, our women couldn't own any businesses at that time, in any land, in any real estate, and get wages paid because we had nothing to do with that. We were already being oppressed. Black women were already being housemaids and maid servants for our oppressor, and sharecropping for our oppressor, right? And prostituting for our oppressor to make ends meet, to help pay for the little shack that we live in on a damn farm, all right? Or to live in the little projects that we used to live in the city. If you're from up north, it depends. You know what I'm saying? All right, we were already working and slaving for pennies on the dollar just to make ends meet. All right. Then eventually we started to have our own businesses and things like that, but we'll get into that later. That's a different topic and discussion. All right. So now, back to the article. So now, and opportunities and greater personal freedom for women. It says greater, right here. I want to highlight it for y'all. Greater personal, greater personal freedom for women. Let's focus on that. Well, we're going to focus on everything. But can anybody tell me what that personal freedom would be? What is that personal freedom? What is that personal freedom? What's that personal? It says greater personal freedom for women. What is that personal freedom? What is that personal freedom? Anybody want to give it a shot? What is that personal freedom talking about? Anybody know? What is that personal freedom? Anybody want to give it a guess? Give y'all some time to answer. What's that personal freedom? Because now we have to understand. The reason why I ask these questions Because a lot of black women believe in this. A lot of so-called black, Hispanic, and Native Americans believe in women's liberation and women's rights and things like that today. Christian women that say that they believe in God and believe in the Most High, go to church every day saying, I love Jesus, I love Christ, you know what I'm saying? And they believe in women's liberation and women's rights. Right? Even though they believe in the Most High, even though they believe in God, even though they believe in Christ, and they say that they love God and they love Christ, but on the contrary, they believe in women's rights and women's liberation. And then the pastors had the nerve, and these women pastors had the nerve just to be women pastors, but these pastors and these women pastors have the nerve to use the Bible to support women's liberation and women's rights based off of what's going on. Now, are we saying that a woman can't have rights? A woman period should have the right to work. All right? You know, you never had to fight a black man. All right? First things first, on a sidebar, okay, the sister answered independence. Explain independence with that personal freedom question. All right? Explain independence. But now, black women never had to fight black men on anything, right, when it comes to working. We would have never stopped our women from working. Why? Because we never stopped our women from being nurses. Our black women used to be nurses in the black community. They used to be maids in the black community. They used to be house cleaners in the white and the black community. So we never stopped our women from working. We always allowed our women, right? We always allowed our women to work if they wanted to work. And if we had the ability to pay them fairly, right, and give them the same wages, we would have. If we were able to, like before the 50s and during the times of the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, we had successful black cities built and successful black, Hispanic, and Native American communities established and built, right? And they were successful. And we were generating wealth, and we were generating money with black men and black women working. And not one black woman had to fight the black man in the 20s, the 30s, and 40s about wages and equal rights. They never had to. That was never a discussion. Some black women took the time out to realize that they're women, and as long as their man is working and providing, supporting for their family, then it was okay. I could just stay at home and just take care of the kids. That was that type of generation. That was that type of time frame. And guess what? Mr. Johnson had a family that he took care of in Norfolk, while he had a family in Chesapeake taking care of. And he would work, and he would slave, and he would take care of them both. That's what he did. And none of them knew about each other. Eventually, at all. Never knew about each other. Unless word got around 20, 30 years later, wondering why two kids have the same last name and they look similar. You know, but it's already too late by then because he's probably 60 years old by the time by then. But whatever the case may be. But so women's liberation, right? And women's rights. So the sister says independence from their man to do what they wanted to do without their husband's permission. Okay, that's a good example. So let's go back to the article real quick. So greater personal freedom for women. Personal freedom. Yes, can this be independence from the man to do what they want? Yes, personal freedom for women, meaning for women to do right, what the sister said, to do what they want. Specifically, how to dress, how to wear what they want, to say what they want, to do what they want, right? To say what they want, to eat what they want, right? To go where they want. Like these are the personal freedoms that the so-called white woman was fighting for in the 60s and 70s, but they also got so-called black and Hispanic and Native American women to also fight for these equal rights and opportunities and greater personal freedom for women. Now let's continue. It said it coincided and it is recognized as a part of the second wave of feminism. Right? It says it coincided and is recognized as part of the second wave of feminism. Does anybody know what that second wave of feminism was? So the first wave, like I said before, the first wave really dealt with this right here. The first wave of feminism, in the first wave of the women's rights movement, in the first wave of the women's liberation movement, right, which was the 19th and early 20th centuries, focused on women's legal rights, especially the right to vote. You would look up women's suffrage, like the women's suffrage movement. You would look, that was the first wave. But here you go. Here's the second wave. This is where it gets a little tricky. All right. So here we go. This is where it gets a little tricky. Now, anyone can look up this article if they want to. All right, Britannica.com. It always gives good information, usually on most historic events like this. But this is also common knowledge. Everyone should know this knowledge about the women's movement, the women's liberation movement. Talk to any woman out there that believes in women's rights and believes in women's liberation. They can try to give you the runaround and the spin around about what's what and what women's rights was really about and what women liberate, whatever. This is general information, right? This is general information that the women's rights and the women's liberation movement was really about. This is just general information. Most women may go into great detail and try to explain and give a reason and a thesis and maybe a hypothesis here and here just to explain why women's rights was good for black, Hispanic, and Native American women, or whatever case they're trying to defend. I don't care about that. I can give a damn about what your thesis may be. I don't care. All right. This is just general information about the women's right and women's liberation movement that no woman can deny, or not one person can deny this general information about the women's liberation and the women's rights movement. In the second wave, feminism of the women's rights movement touched on every area of women's experience, including politics. So the second wave dealt with politics, how women were involved in politics. I don't need to go into the details. If I was in a debate with a woman liberator, all right, or some women's rights advocate, then I would go into the details about how political white and black women were in politics. But that's not today's class, okay? Work, meaning occupation, what kind of jobs that they had and what wages that they got. Work. All right, I kind of did get a little specific there, but I didn't have to. But for class purposes, I kind of wanted to expound and explain the work, okay? So work, this is just basic information that the second wave was about. The family, right? How women's, so let's talk about the family. The second wave touched on every area of experience. And it says the family, meaning what? What's the woman's role in a family? Is it dictated, or should we keep it the same as old times, or keep it traditional, or are we allowed to do what we want when it comes to a family and how we raise a family and things like that? Like, that's the family portion. How women deal, and okay, well, pretty much when it comes to families dealing with a woman, all right, the family, all right, and sexuality, okay, meaning sexuality. So once again, touched on every area of women's experience, including sexual experience, all right. So now, if we go back to the top, when we go back to the top of the article, no, that's not it. When we go back to the top of the article, it says personal freedom. Oh, won't let me highlight it. Personal freedom for women, right? Personal freedom for women, right? So now we know the personal freedom for women, right, in the second wave of the women's liberation and women's rights movement dealt with politics, work, the family, and sexuality. All right? All right? So, the second wave, right, of the women's rights and the women's liberation movement dealt with the personal freedom for women. All right? So now, that's it on the article for now. Now, if you guys want to read more on that article, go ahead. You guys can if y'all want to. All right? Y'all can if y'all want to. Here we go. All right, back on it. So now, the women's rights movement and the women's liberation movement also had to deal with the freedoms of a woman. All right, the freedom. Okay, the freedoms, the personal freedoms of a woman. Salaki. The personal freedoms of a woman. Now, this is the topic right here. We touched base on, we know the history now of women's liberation. All right? We know the context of women's liberation. All right? We know what women's rights and we know now what women's liberation and women's rights was really about. It dealt, the first wave, right, specifically, it dealt with the so-called white woman getting legal rights, specifically to vote. Then, from the 60s and 70s, it started to get into the second wave of personal freedoms, like in politics and work. Actually, work, the family, and sexuality. Sexuality meaning what? Sex. Sex. Sexual intercourse. The right to what? So these are personal freedoms. Think, what personal freedoms can you have sexually? What personal freedoms can a woman have sexually? What would that mean? I mean, think about it. What personal freedom a woman would want sexually? Can anybody answer that question? What personal freedom would a woman want sexually? To be a lesbian. Same sex. What else? What else? Be with, okay, right. Be with whoever they want. Right. Okay, right. Okay. You guys are pretty much going to answer it, but you guys are correct. Right. Threesomes, whatever the case may be. Right. Orgies, whatever the hell it is. Right? You guys are correct. These are the different sexual freedoms, right, that white women were fighting for. Black women were not fighting for those freedoms. You understand that, right? Does everybody understand that? So-called black women weren't fighting for those freedoms, but the white woman was. Everybody understand that? Like the so-called white woman, our oppressor, she was fighting for those freedoms. Being a lesbian, same sex, be with whoever they wanted to be with, threesomes, orgies, like that's what they were fighting for. Black women were never fighting for that. Black women were just fighting for the right to be treated equal. That was the black woman's mindset. But because of our support for our oppressor, because of the black woman's allegiance with our oppressor, because of black women being beguiled and tricked, right, by our oppressor, now our people have adopted that very same freedom, that very same liberation, that very same lifestyle, that very same culture of wanting lesbianism, same sex, to have sex with whoever they want, threesomes, orgies, whatever the case may be. We have now adopted that because of the simple fact that our people made an allegiance, specifically black women made an allegiance and joined together with our oppressor, and not realizing that they were being tricked and beguiled. Right? Black women at that time did not realize that they were being tricked and beguiled. There was a greater scheme of things. While black women were just fighting for the right just to have rights as a black person in America, right? Our oppressor pushed women's liberation and women's rights onto black women, right? Onto Hispanic women, onto Native American women, right? They pushed it onto our women, and they knew what the outcome would be. But our women did not realize the destruction that it caused to our families, our homes, our household, our communities, our cities, our towns. They didn't realize that. Anybody know why black women didn't realize it? Does anyone know why in this class, why black, Hispanic, and Native American women did not realize that they were being tricked and beguiled by our oppressor by accepting women's liberation and women's rights? Does anybody know the answer to that? Does anybody know why they were tricked and beguiled? And why it was able to be done? Does anybody know why it was able to be done? Let's get Genesis chapter 3, verse 13. But still answer the question if you can. Does anybody know why that was able to happen? Why was the oppressor able? Does anybody know why the oppressor was able to trick and beguile black, Hispanic, and Native American women? Inclusive, okay. Exclusive. Okay. Because they also preach integration. You're almost on it. I'm gonna give it to y'all for time's sake, because it's 7:50. and I want to get to some of these scriptures. The reason why our oppressor was able to beguile our women and trick our women into believing in women's liberation and following the women's rights. Yes. Did it deal with integration? Yes. Did it also kind of deal with a woman feeling inclusive? Kind of. But it was because of our leaders. It was because of our black, Hispanic, and Native American leaders that were men, our Christian leaders. It was because of our Christian pastors, right, not teaching black women and not teaching so-called Hispanic women and Native American women that you were never supposed to follow your oppressor in anything. And you were always supposed to follow the man. And you was always supposed to stick side by side by your man. Right? You were supposed to follow your man. Our Christian leaders failed us by accepting integration. And then two, by not realizing that we were always supposed to be separate from our oppressor. If our Christian pastors and leaders knew any better and knew that we were supposed to be separate and knew that we were supposed to divide ourselves from our oppressor, our women would have never been able to be beguiled. And our women would have never been able to be tricked by our oppressor into believing in women's liberation and women's rights. Our black leaders at that time and our black, Hispanic, and Native American Christian leaders at that time only cared about themselves and only cared about the money and only cared about the wealth that they were going to get alone. And they sold black people out, and they sold Hispanics out, and they sold Native Americans out for pennies of the dollar. For pennies of the dollar. And allowed our women, our black, Hispanic, and Native American women to join hand in hand and support and stand side by side and make agreements and covenants with our oppressor dealing with women's rights and women liberation. Our black leaders were supposed to know and be wise enough, especially if you were a Christian. If you claim to be a Christian at that time, and a pastor at that time, and a bishop at that time, and a preacher at that time, and a minister at that time, then that means you read the Bible, and you knew the Bible, and you were supposed to know these scriptures. But, right, you were supposed to know these scriptures. But these scriptures tell us but these scriptures tell us to be separated and divided and severed from these other people, from our oppressor. That's how black women and Hispanic and Native American women were able to be beguiled and tricked by our oppressor. The Lord never intended our women and black, Hispanic, and Native American women to join hand in hand with our oppressor and to be put into a situation where they could be tricked and beguiled. Everything is supposed to deal with the men, and everything was supposed to deal with the man. And there were men in charge at that time. We had black men in charge at that time in the 60s. We had Hispanic men in charge at that time in the 60s. We had a Native American men in charge in the 60s and the 70s. But because of our ignorance, and because of our selfish ways, and because of our greed, and because of the desire to want money and wealth, because we've been poor and living in poverty all our life, we sold our people out, even though deep down inside we knew that we were supposed to be separate from our oppressor. From our oppressor. We were supposed to be separate. Martin Luther King even knew that we were supposed to be separate. That's why before he died, he said, I believe I'm integrating my people into a burning building. Martin Luther King said that. Because deep down inside, he knew that we were supposed to be separate. But because of his filthy, disgusting lust for white women, and his filthy, disgusting desire for our oppressor, and for money, and for wealth, he sold the black women out. He sold the Hispanic women out. And he sold the Native American out for pennies of a dollar, and allowed our women to be tricked and beguiled by our oppressor during the women's liberation movement and the women's rights movement. That's what happened. And Genesis chapter 3, verse 13 says, "And the Most High Power said unto the woman, What is this thou that, what is this that thou hast done?" The Lord is asking Eve. The Lord is asking the woman. This is talking about Eve. And the Lord is asking, woman, what have you done? Like what have you done? Like black woman, what have you done? Hispanic woman, what have you done? Native American woman, what have you done? What have you done? You know what I'm saying? Like, this is what the Lord is asking. And the woman said, the serpent beguiled me. The serpent. And the woman said, this is Eve. Eve said, this is something that Eve said. The serpent beguiled me. The serpent beguiled me. This is in context, man. Adam, which was a man, allowed his woman full reign, authority, and freedom to do what she wanted to do. Adam followed his woman. By Adam following his woman, by Adam following Eve, he gave Eve authority and power and reign and the freedom to do what she wanted to do. And because of Adam allowed that, just like our Christian pastors allowed that, just like our Christian pastors allowed that, and our preachers allowed that, and our bishops allowed that, our ministers allowed that, just like Adam allowed Eve to have authority and reign and freedom to do whatever she wanted, the serpent beguiled me. The serpent was able to beguile Eve. The serpent was able to trick Eve. And everybody understand that? The serpent was able to trick Eve and beguile Eve because Adam allowed his woman to have full reign and authority and the freedom to do whatever she wanted to do. Right? Adam followed his woman. As a man, once you follow your woman, you're giving her the power. As a man, if you follow your woman, you're giving your woman authority. As a man, if you follow your woman, you're giving your woman giving your woman the freedom to do whatever the hell she wants to do. In the ISUPK, we God forbid that, because it's in our law and it's in our history to not allow a woman to have power, authority, and the freedom to do whatever the hell she wants. Why? Because a woman is able to be deceived, tricked, and beguiled. As a man, you can't trick me. You're not going to be able to beguile me. You're not going to be able to deceive me. You're not going to be able to do it. You're not. You're not going to be able to do it. They didn't have to deceive Martin Luther King because he was a man. They didn't have to trick Martin Luther King because he was a man. They didn't have to beguile Martin Luther King because he was a man. That didn't happen. Martin Luther King wasn't tricked. He wasn't beguiled. He wasn't deceived. He had an offer on the table to get rich and to allow his lust to go forever and ever with any white woman he desired. And because that offer was on the table, he sold black, Hispanic, and Native American women for pennies of the dollar. He wasn't tricked for that. He wasn't beguiled for that. You can't trick a man. You can't beguile a man. You can't deceive a man. Absolutely not. We know better. We deal with logic. But this is how you can get a man to do what you want. If you put an offer on the table with that man and make deals and agreements with that man, then you have the possibility, right, of getting that man to do what you want him to do. And that's what they did with Martin Luther King. And by choice, he sold us out. By choice, he allowed every black, Hispanic, and Native American woman to join hands and stand side by side with our oppressor and be tricked and beguiled and deceived by our oppressor during the women's liberation rights. It's like during the women's liberation movement, during the women's rights movement. That's what happened. The serpent beguiled me. Eve was beguiled. She was tricked. She was deceived. And I did eat. Like this is Eve. She ate. Now listen. She didn't eat no apple. She didn't eat no pear, no grape, no none of that. Alright? What Eve ate was the customs and the traditions and the cultures of another nation of people. That tree of good and evil in Genesis, do not eat of that tree of good and evil. That was talking about the other cultures and the traditions and the heritage of the other people in the garden. And she ate that. Eve ate it. She ate the culture and the heritage and the traditions of another nation of people. Just like how black women in the 60s and the 70s, just like Hispanic women and Native American women in the 60s and the 70s ate the cultures and the traditions and the heritage of another nation of people. Specifically, our oppressor, which is the white man. The culture and the heritage and the traditions of America, that's what black women ate. That's what the Hispanic women ate. That's what the Native American women ate. No thanks to our Christian pastors and our Christian black leaders and our Christian Hispanic and Native American leaders not teaching the black, Hispanic, and Native American community to be separate from these other nations and to be separate from America and to be separate from their lifestyle and from their culture and their heritage. Our black leaders failed us. And now, because of so, now we're dealing with the modern day problems and issues that we have in the black, Hispanic, and Native American community today. That's why there are no more fathers in the home. That's why our families are destroyed. That's why our daughters are becoming whores and prostitutes and harlots and having a good old time talking about hot girl summer. We had that very same problem in the 90s, and it was called Freaknik. Oh yeah, if you're old enough, you know what I'm talking about. Hot girl summer ain't nothing new. You thought hot girl summer was new? Go back and run them tapes in the 90s. Freaknik was the outcome of Martin Luther King. Yeah, some of our mothers that were born in the 70s, that was in their 20s, I guess, in the 90s, whatever the 40s and the 90s, they were up there freaknik, twerking, weaning, grinding, whatever the case may be. That was the outcome, right? Right, in ATL. That was the outcome of women's liberation. That was the outcome of women's rights when black, Hispanic, and Native American women decided to join hand in hand with our oppressor and decided to support the women's liberation movement and the women's rights movement. No thanks to our Christian leaders not teaching our communities to be separate. Now our sons out there are being gangbangers and took the lifestyle and the culture and the tradition of being a gangster from the mafia and Goodfellas and Scarface and the Godfather and the casino and these mobsters, right? And now we are killing each other just like Scarface. We're killing each other just like the Godfather would do. We're killing each other just like the casino would do. We're killing each other just like Goodfellas would do. And we're murdering each other. And we're killing each other. And we're banging on each other. And we're unloading clips on each other. And not just on each other, but on innocent families, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, and innocent bystanders that got nothing to do with nothing. That's what's happening. That's the outcome of women's liberation. That was the outcome. These are outcomes of women's liberation. This is the outcomes of women's rights movement when Black, Hispanic, and Native American women decided to support and stand side by side and join our oppressor during this movement. No thanks to these Christian pastors not teaching us to be separate and separate from our oppressor and to divide ourselves from our oppressor and sever ourselves from our oppressor. This is the outcome. And so Eve ate this lifestyle. Just like today, Black, Hispanic, and Native American women, and now Black, Hispanic, and Native American men, women, and children also eat this very same lifestyle. The cultures, the lifestyle, right, ate the very same culture and traditions of another nation of people. Because Eve wasn't just the only one that ate. Who else ate? Who was following Eve to eat too? Anybody? Who also followed Eve to eat too? Who also followed Eve to eat? Correct. Adam. Adam ate too. And once the man followed Eve to eat, once Adam followed Eve to eat the culture and the lifestyle of these other nations, that's when we became destroyed. That's when Adam and Eve became naked. Everybody understand that? Everybody get that? Everybody understand? That's when they became naked. That's when they became destroyed. Because they were following the culture and the heritage and the traditions of another nation of people when they ate. And it destroyed them. Just like it's destroying us. Let's drop down to verse 16. Like the Lord, this is the reason why. Now, let's drop down to verse 16. Like this is the reason why the Lord never wanted our women to have the freedom. Because of what Eve did, right? Because of what Adam and Eve did, right? Because of Adam following his woman and being weak under his woman and allowing his woman to do whatever she wants to do. And because of so, allowed her to be beguiled and tricked and deceived. Because of Eve being beguiled, tricked, and deceived, this is the reason why the Lord put these laws into place dealing with a woman. The Lord never wanted a woman to be free and have these personal freedoms like we're fighting for now and like our women have now, like the women's liberation and the women's rights. There's a reason why, this is the reason why the Lord does not want our women to have these freedoms. This is the reason why. Right here, this is the reason why. And this was the solution to it. If you want the solution to the black community, if you want the solution how to fix the black, Hispanic, and Native American community, first things first, allow the man to lead. Allow the man to have authority. Shut women's liberation down. Shut women's rights down. Take that ideology and shove it somewhere else and get it far away and out of the minds of the black, Hispanic, and Native American women, and then we can talk about fixing the black, Hispanic, and Native American community. I don't need to have a discussion with a woman about how to fix the black, Hispanic, and Native American community. Because all the black woman is going to say, any black, Hispanic, Native American, listen, I've heard it all before. As a man, as a brother in the truth, I've heard it all. And sometimes I get sick of it. Most black, Hispanic, and Native American women will say, well, it's the man's responsibility to fix the community. It's the man's fault, right? It's the man's fault. It's the man's fault on why we're here now and all this stuff that's going on in the black, Hispanic, Native American community. And I hear this all the time. And here's my outlook on it. Okay, then shut the hell up and let me lead. Okay, you can blame me if that's the case. I just need you to shut the hell up. Okay, you did your part. Let me do mine. My part is telling you to shut the hell up and let me take control and let me fix the community then. Your job is done. Thank you. If that's the case. If it's so my fault, allow me to correct it. Here's me correcting it. Be quiet. And stop believing in women's liberation. And stop believing in women's rights. Stop believing in that garbage. There's a reason why the Lord never wanted black women to have that type of freedom. Because it can cause destruction. It can cause losing of families. It can take a man out of the home. It can allow our oppressor to make laws and rules and regulations and policies to oppress us and to get black men out of the home and turn us into drug dealers and turn us into criminals and turn us into murderers and turn us into thieves and then turn around and lock us up and throw us in prison and give us 20 to life without parole. This was their game. This was their set. This was their plan. This was their game set. I mean, it's like this was their plan. They set this up. They designed it this way. They take all the money and the wealth out of the black community. And now they push drugs and illegal firearms into our community. And then turns us into drug dealers and taught us how to sell drugs. And then made us into drug addicts. And then turns us into thieves because we're only making pennies of the dollar. And we're making below minimum wage or minimum wage, working at Burger King, McDonald's, Hardee's, Popeyes, KFC, Walmart. Well, I don't think Walmart was there. Save-A-Lot, Costco, ShopRite, any grocery store, all these for pennies of the dollar, minimum wage, or a little bit above minimum wage, trying to survive and feed our families. And you don't think that we're not going to steal or kill each other for some food or for a blanket or a TV or a home or a house? Because we got to hear every day, Daddy, I'm hungry. Mommy, I'm hungry. When's our next meal? And you expect us to live in these harsh conditions? And then you call us criminals and then you lock us up. This is because of women's liberation. All of this is because of women's liberation and women's rights. Who would have known? Who would have known that this was all behind the fact of women's liberation and women's rights? No thanks to our Christian leaders and pastors and our black leaders not teaching our people to divide ourselves from our oppressor, from these other nations and races of people, and to separate and divide and sever ourselves from America. All of this happened because of that. and women's liberation and women's rights is a big subcategory of the condition of the reason why we're living in the most harsh conditions ever. Let's get it. Here's the solution. And this is the solution, right? This is the solution to fix the Black, Hispanic, Native American community. Right? Here's the solution to it. And the Lord says in verse 16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. And sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. So the Lord said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. I'm going to multiply your sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. Meaning in the most excruciating pain ever, right? You're going to suffer in childbearing. I'm going to remind you every time you decide to have sex and get pregnant, why you should shut the hell up, why you should be quiet, and why you should listen to your man. Every time you lay on that bed to give birth to a son or a daughter, I'm going to remind you why you should shut up and be quiet and not roam free and listen to your man. Like the Lord had a purpose. The Lord said, multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. The Lord is going to multiply thy sorrow, your sadness and your grief. He's going to multiply it. Does anybody understand why the Black, Hispanic, and Native American women are the number one women in America that go through depression? Anybody? Did anybody know that? Does anybody know that like right there? Black, Hispanic, and Native American women, right, go through the most deepness, distress, sadness, and they're so unhappy. And black women are so unhappy, unpleasant, and going through depression. And here's why.